The moment my daughter-in-law leaned across the kitchen island and looked me straight in the eye, saying, "Go ahead, if you are so brave, just leave. You will not last a week without us." Something inside me that had been quiet for far too long finally cracked, but I didn't shout, and I didn't argue. I simply placed the keys to the house I built with my own two hands on the counter, while my son stood behind her, pretending not to see the humiliation burning across my face. Then I walked out without a suitcase, without a plan, and without looking back. By sunrise, the calls began. First from my son, then from my daughter-in-law, then from numbers I did not recognize. By noon, her voice was shaking. By evening, his boss was calling me, asking if I had really done what they claimed. And the next morning, the bank manager was begging me to come in immediately. That was the moment they realized the truth. They had pushed the wrong old man too far. They thought I was dependent. They thought I was weak. They thought I would crumble without their crumbs. But what they never knew, what they never bothered to ask, was that the entire foundation of their comfortable little empire, every house, every account, every contract, every privilege they tossed around like they owned the world, was standing on my name, and I had finally decided to stop carrying them. If you stay with me until the end, you will understand exactly how a quiet, widowed father turned their arrogance into ashes and reclaimed the life they thought they could take from him. My name is Robert Hensley. I am 72 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 45 years designing water treatment plants across Ohio. My wife Helen used to say, "I had a gift for making things that endured." She passed away 2 years ago. And since then, I've learned that some things, no matter how carefully you build them, can still collapse from the inside. The evening it all changed began like any other. I had moved in with my son Michael and his wife Vanessa after Helen's funeral, believing their invitation came from love. For 2 years, I tried to make myself useful, cooking, driving my granddaughter Emily to school, fixing things around the house. But somewhere along the way, gratitude turned to expectation, and expectation curdled into something colder. That night, I stood at the stove preparing dinner while Vanessa scrolled through her phone at the kitchen table. I moved a little slower these days, but I took pride in the meals I made. Helen had taught me her recipes before she got too sick to stand, and cooking them felt like keeping a small piece of her alive. "The chicken's dry again," Vanessa said without looking up. I didn't respond. I had learned that responding only made things worse. Michael came in from the living room, loosening his tie. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek and glanced at me. "Smells good, Dad." "It would smell better if you followed a recipe," Vanessa muttered. "I want." Set the plates on the table in silence. Emily, 16, and quietly observant, sat down without a word. She had her mother's dark hair, but her grandmother's eyes, the kind that saw more than they let on. We ate in near silence. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa sighed and pushed her plate forward. "Robert, I need to talk to you about something." I looked up my fork, pausing mid-air. "You've been here 2 years now," she continued, her voice taking on that practiced tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "And frankly, it's been difficult. You take up space. You slow everything down. I spend half my day cleaning up after your little projects." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Vanessa, no." "Mike, someone has to say it." She turned to face me directly, her eyes flat and cold. "You're useless here. You can barely cook. You forget things constantly, and honestly, you make this house feel smaller just by being in it." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. I felt Emily stiffen beside me, but I kept my gaze steady on Vanessa's face. "If you're so unhappy," I said quietly, "perhaps I should leave." She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the walls I had helped paint 3 summers ago. "Go ahead, leave if you're so brave. You wouldn't last a week without us." I looked at Michael, then waiting, hoping. Surely my own son would say something, but he only stared at his plate, jaw tight, refusing to meet my eyes. That silence, his silence, cut deeper than anything Vanessa could have said. It was the silence of a man who had chosen his side long ago and lacked the courage to admit it. I thought of Helen in that moment, of the words she had whispered to me in the hospital, her hand thin and pale in mine. "Robert, keep the safe deposit key to yourself. Don't trust everything you see." I hadn't understood then. I was too consumed by grief to hear the warning beneath her words. I understood now. Without a word, I stood from the table. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the house key I had carried for 2 years, and placed it gently on the table beside my half-eaten dinner. The small click of metal on wood seemed louder than it should have been. "Robert, don't be dramatic," Vanessa said, rolling her eyes. I walked toward the front door, my footsteps steady, my heart calmer than it had been in months. Behind me, I heard Emily whisper, "Grandpa," but I didn't turn around. Not yet. As my hand touched the doorknob, Vanessa called out one last time, her voice bright with triumph. "This is my house now." I paused, turned slightly, and smiled. "Is it?" The question hung in the air, simple and quiet. Vanessa's smirk faltered for just a moment, confusion flickering across her face like a shadow passing over water. But before she could respond, I stepped through the door and into the cool evening air. The night swallowed me whole, and I let it. Vanessa watched him leave, still laughing. She didn't know. Those keys she mocked were about to unlock her worst nightmare. I drove through the night without a destination, letting the dark roads carry me wherever they wanted. The headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating nothing but empty asphalt and the occasional reflector post. My hands were steady on the wheel, steadier than they had been in months. There's a strange clarity that comes when you finally stop pretending, when you let go of the hope that people will change. I had spent 2 years waiting for Michael to defend me, waiting for Vanessa to soften, waiting for something that was never going to come. By the time dawn began to break, I found myself parked outside the house Helen and I had built together 38 years ago. I hadn't been here since I moved in with Michael and Vanessa. The lawn was overgrown. The paint on the shutters had started to peel, but the structure itself stood exactly as we had designed it. Solid, patient, waiting. I sat in the car for a long time, watching the morning light creep across the familiar walls before I finally stepped out and walked to the front door. The key still fit. The hinges still creaked in the same place, and when I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust and something else, something that felt like Helen herself preserved in the stillness. I didn't know it then, but while I was unlocking the door to my past, Vanessa was discovering a truth that would shatter her future. She had woken that morning in high spirits. According to what I would later learn from Emily, Vanessa spent the first hour after breakfast on the phone with her friends, laughing about how she had finally gotten rid of the old man. She spoke as if I were a piece of furniture she had donated to charity, an inconvenience that had finally been removed. Her voice carried through the house, bright and triumphant, while Michael sat silently at the kitchen table, pretending to read the newspaper. "I told him to leave, and he actually left," she said into the phone, her laughter sharp and self-satisfied. "Can you believe it?" 2 years of tiptoeing around that man, and all it took was one honest conversation. Mike was useless, of course, but what else is new? After she hung up, she turned her attention to more practical matters. Now that I was gone, she wanted to make sure everything was properly secured. She began searching through the filing cabinet in the home office, pulling out folders and documents, looking for property deeds and account statements. What she found stopped her cold. The house, the very house she had just claimed as her own, was registered entirely in my name. Robert Hensley, sole owner. The mortgage had been paid off 12 years ago, and there was no record of Michael ever being added to the title. "Mike!" she screamed. He came running still, holding his coffee cup. "What? What's wrong?" She thrust the papers at him, her face pale with disbelief. "Did you know about this? Did you know your father owns this house?" Michael stared at the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like shame. I thought we were on the title. Mom handled all of that when we moved in." She said what? He swallowed hard. "She said everything was taken care of, that we didn't need to worry about paperwork." Vanessa tore through the rest of the files with frantic hands. The cars both registered to me. The joint bank account she thought she had access to. It was actually a secondary account I had set up for household expenses with a balance of less than $3,000. The real accounts, the ones Helen and I had built over 4 decades of careful saving, were untouched and untouchable. And then she found the document that made her blood run cold. It was a clause from a living trust, typed in formal legal language, but clear enough for anyone to understand. Michael Hensley and spouse are permitted to reside at the property located at 4527 Maple Ridge Drive as guests, not tenants. This residential privilege may be revoked at any time by Robert Hensley with 30 days written notice. This arrangement shall not constitute any legal tenancy or ownership claim. Helen had written this. My Helen, who smiled at everyone and never raised her voice, who brought cookies to neighbors and volunteered at the church. She had seen something in Vanessa that I had been too blind to recognize, and she had prepared for it. Back at our old house, I stood in the living room, surrounded by dust motes floating in the morning light. Everything was exactly as we had left it. Helen's reading chair by the window, the bookshelf she had organized by color because she said it made her happy, the small wooden box on the mantel where she kept her most precious things. I walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. Behind her winter coats, pushed to the very back, was the fireproof safe we had bought 20 years ago. My fingers remembered the combination without my mind having to recall it. Our wedding anniversary, her birthday, the year Michael was born. Inside, beneath the insurance papers and the deed to this house, I found a sealed envelope. The paper was cream-colored, the kind Helen used for important letters. On the front, in her graceful handwriting, were the words, "Only open when you need to protect yourself." I held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of whatever waited inside. Helen had been gone for 2 years, but somehow she was still here, still watching over me, still one step ahead of the people who wished me harm. Robert's hands trembled as he broke the seal. Helen had known. She had always known. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I carried it to Helen's reading chair by the window and sat down slowly, the morning light warming my face the way it used to warm hers. For a moment I simply held it against my chest, breathing in the faint scent of cedar that still clung to everything in this house. Then I slid my finger beneath the seal and opened it. Inside were 3 pages of Helen's handwriting, the same graceful script that had written grocery lists and birthday cards and love notes tucked into my lunchbox for 40 years. But these words were different. These words carried weight I wasn't prepared for. My dearest Robert, the letter began. If you're reading this, what I feared has happened. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. You would have confronted her directly, and that would have ruined everything. You've always been too honest for your own good. It's one of the things I love most about you and the reason I had to protect you in secret. I stopped reading. My throat had tightened so suddenly that I couldn't breathe. Helen's voice was so clear in these words, so alive that for one impossible moment, I forgot she was gone. I forced myself to continue. I've been watching Vanessa since she started dating Michael. Something about her never sat right with me. The way she studied our family before she joined it. The way she asked questions about our finances that a young woman in love shouldn't think to ask. The way she looked at you sometimes when she thought no one was watching. Not with affection, Robert, but with calculation. So I did something I never told you about. I hired a private investigator. My hands began to shake. Helen, my gentle trusting. Helen had hired someone to investigate our son's wife. The woman who baked cookies for church fundraisers and organized neighborhood watch meetings had been conducting her own quiet investigation for years. Our daughter-in-law is not who she pretends to be. Her real name is Veronica Shaw. 8 years ago in Arizona, she was investigated for something called undue influence over an elderly man named Gerald Patterson. He was 78 years old, a retired professor with no children and a modest estate. Vanessa Veronica befriended him at a community center. Within 18 months, she had convinced him to change his will, naming her as the sole beneficiary. He died 6 months later. His distant relatives tried to contest the inheritance, claiming she had manipulated a vulnerable old man, but they couldn't prove anything in court. She collected the money, changed her name, and moved to Ohio. 2 years later, she met R. Michael. I set the letter down because I could no longer see the words through my tears. The pattern was so clear now, so horrifically clear. Vanessa hadn't fallen in love with Michael. She had selected him, selected us the same way she had selected Gerald Patterson. We were her next target, and she had been playing the long game from the very beginning. I wiped my eyes and picked up the letter again. I've prepared everything with an attorney named Linda Graves. She specializes in elder law and has seen cases like this before. I've given her copies of the investigation files, and together we've set up legal protections that Vanessa cannot touch. The house, the accounts, the trust, Everything is structured so that you remain in control no matter what she tries. Call Linda when you're ready. She's expecting to hear from you even if it takes years. There was more. Helen had included details about the trust structure, about the clause that designated Michael and Vanessa as guests rather than tenants, about bank accounts that had been quietly separated from anything they could access. She had built a fortress around me while pretending to be nothing more than a dying woman saying goodbye. And then, near the bottom of the second page, a line that made my heart stop. "There's something else I hid, Robert. In your woodworking shed beneath the old workbench where we used to sit together on summer evenings. Don't look for it until you truly need it. You'll know when the time comes. It's the proof that will end her if it ever comes to that." The third page was shorter, more personal. Helen wrote about how much she loved me, how proud she was of the life we had built, how sorry she was that she couldn't stay longer to protect me herself. She wrote about Michael too, not with anger, but with the particular sadness of a mother who knows her child has been lost to someone else's influence. "Forgive him if you can," she wrote. "He doesn't see what she is. Love makes us blind sometimes. But you, my darling, you were never blind to me. You saw exactly who I was from the first day we met, and you loved me anyway. That's why I know you'll survive this. That's why I know you'll win." I folded the letter fully and held it against my chest. Then I did something I hadn't done since the day we buried her. I wept. Not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere I had kept locked for 2 years. I wept for Helen, for her courage, for the battle she had fought alone while cancer consumed her body. I wept for myself, for the danger I hadn't seen, for the son who had drifted so far from the man I raised him to be. When the tears finally stopped, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. I found my phone and dialed the number Helen had written at the bottom of the letter. It rang twice before a woman answered, her voice calm and professional. "This is Linda Graves." "My name is Robert Hensley," I said. "Helen told me to call you. I'm ready." There was a pause, and when Linda spoke again, her voice had changed. Sharper now, almost eager. "Robert, your wife prepared more than you can imagine. Meet me tomorrow. It's time to finish what she started." While I was discovering the depth of Helen's protection, the house I had left behind was falling into chaos. I learned all of this later from Emily, who told me everything with the quiet precision of someone who had been watching and waiting for the right moment to speak. The morning after I left, Vanessa woke late. There was no smell of coffee brewing, no breakfast warming on the stove, no sound of someone else already moving through the house. She stumbled downstairs expecting to find something prepared, only to discover a cold kitchen and an empty coffee pot. For 2 years, I had been the one who started each day setting the timer on the coffee maker, preparing meals, making sure the household ran smoothly. It had become so automatic that no one noticed until it stopped. Emily missed her bus. Without me there to wake her early and drive her when she ran behind schedule, she found herself stranded in the driveway, watching the yellow bus disappear around the corner. Vanessa, still in her robe and furious about the coffee situation, refused to drive her. Michael had to cancel his first meeting of the day to take Emily to school, arriving 20 minutes after the bell had already rung. "This is ridiculous," he muttered as he pulled back into the driveway. How did everything fall apart in one night? But that was only the beginning. By noon, Vanessa discovered that the electricity bill had not been paid. The automatic payment had been set up through an account in my name, an account she had no access to. She called the power company in a panic, only to be told that she wasn't authorized to make changes to the account. The internet went down next, tied to the same payment system. Then the water bill notice arrived, marked with a warning about service interruption. Michael came home early to find Vanessa pacing the living room, her phone pressed to her ear, shouting at some customer service representative who couldn't help her. Emily sat on the stairs, silent and watchful, doing her homework as if the chaos around her was nothing more than background noise. "He did this on purpose," Vanessa screamed after she hung up. "That vindictive old man set this up to punish us. He knew exactly what would happen when he left." Michael rubbed his temples. "Vanessa, he couldn't have known." "Of course he knew. Everything runs through his name, his accounts, his precious little systems. He's been controlling us this entire time, and we never even realized it." There was something in Michael's face, then a flicker of doubt that Emily noticed, even if her mother did not. He walked to the filing cabinet in the office and began pulling out documents, the same ones Vanessa had torn through earlier. He studied them for a long time, his expression growing darker with each page. "How did Dad control so much without us knowing?" he finally asked, his voice quiet. "The house, the utilities, the insurance on both cars. None of it has my name on it. We've been living here for 5 years and I never once thought to check." Vanessa snatched the papers from his hands. "Because your mother handled everything, and then your father took over. They kept us dependent on purpose. It's a power play, Mike. It's always been a power play." But Michael didn't look convinced. He looked like a man who had just realized the foundation beneath his feet was not as solid as he believed. Emily watched all of this from her perch on the stairs. She had her grandmother's gift for observation, the ability to sit quietly and absorb everything while appearing to be focused on something else entirely. She saw the panic in her mother's eyes, the confusion in her father's posture, and she began to understand something that neither of them seemed to grasp. Grandpa Robert had not been a burden. He had been the one holding everything together. That night, after her parents had exhausted themselves with arguing and gone to bed early, Emily crept downstairs to get a glass of water. She was halfway to the kitchen when she heard her mother's voice coming from the living room, low, hushed, speaking into the phone. Emily pressed herself against the wall and listened. "Don't worry about it," Vanessa was saying. "He's just throwing a tantrum. The old man will crawl back within a week. He has nowhere else to go, and he's too proud to admit he needs us." A pause. "Yes, I know it's taking longer than we planned, but when he dies, everything will be ours. The house alone is worth over $800,000. We just have to be patient." Emily's heart stopped. She stood frozen in the darkness, her back against the cold wall, trying to process what she had just heard. Her mother wasn't upset that Grandpa had left. She was upset that he hadn't died yet. Moving on instinct, Emily retreated silently to her room. She opened her phone with trembling fingers and navigated to the family cloud account, the one her parents didn't realize she could access. Her mother's text messages synced automatically, stored without Vanessa's knowledge. Emily scrolled through recent conversations until she found one with a contact saved only as VS. The messages were brief but damning, filled with references to waiting, to patience, to plans that would come together when the time was right. Emily took screenshots of everything. She didn't know what she would do with them yet. She only knew that something was very wrong, and that her grandfather might be the only person who could explain it. She closed her eyes, her mother's words echoing in her head. She had just heard the truth she never wanted to believe. Linda Graves lived in a modest Victorian house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that looked like it had witnessed 100 years of secrets and kept every single one. I arrived at 10 in the morning, having spent a sleepless night reading and rereading Helen's letter until the words blurred together. The woman who answered the door was tall and silver-haired with sharp eyes that assessed me in a single glance. She was 68 years old. I would later learn a retired elder law attorney who had spent her career protecting people like me from people like Vanessa. "Robert," she said, not as a question. "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years. Come in." Her office was in the back of the house, a room lined with law books and filing cabinets and framed photographs of clients, mostly elderly couples smiling with gratitude. She gestured for me to sit in a worn leather chair across from her desk, then poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if I wanted one. Helen and I met 15 years ago at a women's shelter fundraiser. Linda began settling into her own chair. She was volunteering in the kitchen, and I was giving a talk about financial abuse in families. We became friends almost immediately. She had a way of seeing people, Robert, really seeing them. I suppose you know that better than anyone. I nodded, not trusting my voice. 3 years ago, she came to me with concerns about your daughter-in-law. At first, I thought she was being overprotective. Mothers-in-law often are, but Helen wasn't the type to worry without reason, so I agreed to look into it. Linda opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. What I found changed everything. She slid the folder across the desk. I opened it with hands that had steadied overnight and found myself staring at a photograph of a younger Vanessa. Different hair, softer features, but unmistakably the same woman. Beneath the photo was a name, Veronica Shaw. Her real name, Linda said. She changed it legally 6 years ago, shortly after relocating from Arizona to Ohio. The timing wasn't coincidental. I turned the page and found court documents, police reports, newspaper clippings. The story they told made my stomach turn. 8 years ago, Veronica Shaw befriended a retired professor named Gerald Patterson. He was 78, recently widowed, no children. She met him at a community center where she volunteered. Sound familiar? Within 18 months, she had moved into his home as a caregiver. Within 2 years, she was the sole beneficiary of his estate. He died shortly after, and his distant relatives filed a lawsuit claiming undue influence in elder financial exploitation. What happened? The case was dismissed. They couldn't prove she had done anything illegal, just morally reprehensible. Veronica collected her inheritance, changed her name to Vanessa, and disappeared. 2 years later, she surfaced in Ohio, where she happened to meet a charming young architect named Michael Hensley at a coffee shop. Linda's voice was flat, clinical. Your son never stood a chance. She had researched your family before she ever spoke to him. She knew about the house, the savings, the stability. She selected him the way a predator selects prey. I closed the folder. I couldn't look at anymore. Helen asked me to help her build protections. Linda continued, we created a living trust that keeps every asset under your sole control. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds. None of it can be touched without your explicit consent. Michael has no legal claim to any of it, and neither does his wife. The clause about guest residency was Helen's idea. She wanted to make sure that if things ever went wrong, you would have the power to remove them from the property without a lengthy eviction process. She thought of everything, I whispered. She did, and she did something else, something that will matter when the time comes. Linda leaned forward. Ohio is a one-party consent state, Robert. That means Helen had every legal right to record any conversation she was part of without informing the other person. Whatever evidence she gathered is completely admissible in court. The implication hung in the air between us. Helen hadn't just prepared legal documents. She had prepared proof. What do we do now? I asked. Linda smiled, a careful, calculating smile that reminded me of a chess player contemplating the board. We wait. We gather more evidence. We let Vanessa make mistakes because people like her always do. She spent years building a perfect image, but that image is fragile. The moment she feels secure, she'll overreach, and when she does, we'll be ready. And if she doesn't make mistakes, she already has. She pushed you out of the house too soon. She showed her hand before she had full control. That's not the behavior of someone who's confident. It's the behavior of someone who's getting impatient. Linda stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner. She retrieved another folder thinner than the first and handed it to me. This is just the beginning, she said, but the real evidence. It's still in your woodworking shed, exactly where Helen hid it. The woodworking shed stood at the back of our property, half hidden by the old oak tree Helen had insisted we never cut down. I hadn't been inside since before she got sick. The padlock was rusted, and it took several tries before the key finally turned. When the door swung open, dust motes swirled in the afternoon light, tiny ghosts disturbed from their rest. Everything was exactly as we had left it. My tools hung on their pegboard hooks, arranged by size, the way Helen had organized them one rainy Saturday afternoon. The half-finished birdhouse I had been building for our backyard still sat clamped to the workbench, waiting for hands that had never returned to complete it. Sawdust covered every surface undisturbed for over 2 years. The air smelled of cedar and machine oil and something fainter beneath it all, the lavender hand cream Helen used to wear. I walked slowly through the space, running my fingers along the workbench where we had spent so many summer evenings together. Helen would sit on the old stool in the corner, reading aloud from whatever novel she was enjoying while I sanded and shaped and built. She said the sound of my work was soothing, that it helped her think. I had assumed those evenings were simply about companionship, about two people who loved each other sharing space. Now I understood that she had been watching, planning, preparing for a battle I didn't know was coming. The compartment was exactly where her letter said it would be, beneath the workbench, hidden behind a panel I had never noticed. I knelt on the dusty floor and felt along the wood until my fingers found a small groove. The panel slid aside to reveal a fireproof box, compact and heavy, wedged into the space between the floor joists. Inside were 2 items, an old digital voice recorder and a USB drive labeled in Helen's handwriting with a single word, evidence. My hands trembled as I connected the recorder to a small speaker I found on the shelf. The device was outdated but functional, and when I pressed play, Helen's voice filled the shed, clear, calm, and very much alive. The first recording was dated 18 months before her death. I could hear the clink of teacups and the distant sound of traffic through an open window. Helen and Vanessa were having what sounded like a casual conversation, but Vanessa's voice carried an edge I had never noticed before. "I'm just saying, Helen, it would make things so much easier if you added Mike's name to the house title. For tax purposes, you understand. And if something were to happen to either of you, the transition would be smoother." "Nothing is going to happen to us," Helen replied pleasantly. "Robert and I have our affairs in order. But you're not getting any younger, neither of you. And Robert's memory has been slipping lately, hasn't it? I've noticed him forgetting things." There was a pause before Helen spoke again. "Robert's memory is fine, but thank you for your concern." The second recording was worse. Vanessa's tone had shifted from suggestive to threatening, though she was careful to keep her words just vague enough to deny their meaning. "I worry about Robert being alone in that big house if something happens to you, Helen. An old man, confused, vulnerable. Anything could happen. He really should have family nearby to look after him, to make decisions for him if it comes to that." Helen's response was ice. "Robert is perfectly capable of making his own decisions. For now," Vanessa said, "but these things change quickly. I've seen it happen." The third recording made my blood run cold. It was dated just 3 months before Helen died, when the cancer had already begun to steal her strength. Her voice was thinner, weaker, but her words were steel. "You won't live forever, Helen," Vanessa said, and there was no pretense of politeness anymore. "And when you're gone, Robert will need someone to take care of him, someone like me." A long silence followed. Then Helen spoke, and I could hear in her voice the same quiet fury I had fallen in love with 50 years ago. "I know exactly what you are, Vanessa, and I've prepared for you." The recording ended abruptly. I sat in the dusty shed, my chest heaving, my eyes burning. Helen had fought this woman alone while her body was failing, while she was dying. She had gathered evidence and built legal fortresses and hidden weapons in the walls of our life together, all without saying a single word to me. Sheepik had protected me the only way she knew how, by making sure I would never have to face this enemy unprepared. The fifth file was different. It was addressed directly to me, recorded in what must have been her final weeks. "Robert, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone and they've made their move. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. You would have confronted her and she would have slipped away. But now you have everything you need. Be patient, be smart, and know that I loved you more than I could ever say. Now it's your turn." I was still sitting there, tears streaming down my face, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Grandpa, it's Emily. Can we meet? Don't tell Mom or Dad." I chose a small cafe 30 miles outside of town, the kind of place where nobody would recognize either of us. I arrived early and took a booth near the back facing the door, nursing a cup of coffee I didn't really want. My mind was still reeling from the recordings from Helen's voice echoing in my ears from the weight of everything I now carried. When the bell above the door chimed and Emily walked in, I almost didn't recognize her at first. She looked older than 16, her face pale and drawn, her eyes scanning the room with the weariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. She spotted me and walked over quickly, sliding into the seat across from mine without a word. For a long moment we just looked at each other. I saw Helen in her eyes, that same quiet intelligence, that same ability to observe without being observed. "Thank you for meeting me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who else to talk to. "You can always talk to me, Emily, always." She nodded, but her hands were trembling as she wrapped them around the glass of water the waitress had left. I waited, giving her the space to find her words. Helen had taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply be patient. "I know what Mom is," Emily said at last. "I've known for a while, I think. I just didn't want to believe it." "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "I've been watching her grandpa for months now. The way she talks about you when you're not around. The way she manipulates Dad into agreeing with everything she says. The phone calls late at night when she thinks everyone is asleep." Her voice cracked slightly. "I heard her the night you left. She was on the phone with someone laughing about how you'd come crawling back. And then she said something that made me sick. What did she say? Emily met my eyes directly. She said, "When you die, everything would be theirs." She talked about you like you were just an obstacle, Grandpa, like you were already gone and she was just waiting to collect. The words confirmed what I already knew, but hearing them from my granddaughter's lips made them somehow more real, more terrible. This was the woman who had sat at our dinner table, who had smiled and laughed and pretended to be part of our family, all while counting the days until she could profit from my death. "There's more," Emily said. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through screenshots. "Mom doesn't know I have access to her messages. We share a family cloud account and she never changed the settings. I've been saving everything just in case." She turned the phone toward me, and I saw a string of text messages between Vanessa and someone saved simply as VS. The messages were clinical, businesslike, completely devoid of the warmth Vanessa performed so convincingly in public. "The old man is out," one message read. "Now we wait for him to die. The house alone is worth $800K. Another, "Don't rush it. We've waited this long. A few more years won't matter. And finally, once Mike inherits, we can finally cash out. Just keep him happy until then." I stared at the screen, my coffee forgotten and growing cold. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just Helen's recordings, not just Linda's investigation file, but now this digital proof of a conspiracy that had been unfolding around me for years. "Who is VS?" I asked. "I don't know," Emily admitted, "but they've been messaging for at least 2 years. It's always the same updates about the plan, questions about timing. It's like Mom is reporting to someone." I thought about the Arizona case, about Veronica Shaw befriending Gerald Patterson at a community center. People like Vanessa didn't work alone. They had networks, mentors, people who taught them how to select victims and avoid detection. VS could be anyone, a partner, a handler, perhaps even a family member who had raised her in this particular form of cruelty. "Emily," I said carefully, "does your father know any of this?" She shook her head. "Dad doesn't see anything he doesn't want to see. He loves her, or at least he thinks he does. She's made sure of that." I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. They were cold, still trembling. "You've been carrying this alone. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do," she said, tears finally spilling over. "I couldn't tell Dad. I couldn't go to the police without proof. And then you left, and I thought maybe you'd figured it out too." "Your grandmother figured it out first," I told her. "She left me everything I need, and now you've given me even more." Emily wiped her eyes and looked at me with sudden determination. "I'm not going back to live with her, Grandpa. I can't pretend anymore. I want to stay with you." I pulled her into an embrace, holding my granddaughter the way I had when she was small, when the world was simpler and the monsters were only in storybooks. "Your grandmother always said you'd be the one to see the truth," I whispered. She was right. When we finally pulled apart, Emily looked at me with those clear, intelligent eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked. I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Now we wait for her to make her next mistake." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by certified mail with a signature requirement. Linda had insisted on every formality, every legal protection that would make the document unassailable. I had signed it in her office 2 days earlier, my hands steady, my conscience clear. The words were simple and direct. Michael Hensley and Vanessa Hensley were hereby notified that their residential privilege at the property located at 4527 Maple Ridge Drive was being revoked pursuant to the terms of the Helen Hensley Living Trust. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. I wasn't there when Vanessa opened it, but Emily told me everything later, describing the scene with the detached precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. The mail had arrived just after noon. Michael was at work and Vanessa was in the kitchen scrolling through real estate listings on her laptop, already planning renovations for a house she didn't own. Dreaming of profit from an inheritance that would never come, she signed for the envelope without really looking at it, assuming it was some routine legal correspondence about the utility account she had been trying to transfer into her name. When she read the first paragraph, her face went white. By the second paragraph, she was screaming. Michael came home early that day, summoned by a frantic phone call that Emily could hear from her bedroom upstairs. He walked through the front door to find his wife pacing the living room like a caged animal. The letter crumpled in her fist. "Your father is trying to throw us out of our own house," Vanessa shrieked. He's giving us 30 days, Mike. 30 days to pack up our lives and leave. Michael took the letter and read it slowly, his brow furrowing with each line. "This is from a law firm," he said quietly. "Linda Graves. I don't recognize the name. I don't care whose name is on it. Your father is attacking us. He's punishing us because I finally told him the truth about how useless he was." Vanessa snatched the letter back. "This is illegal. It has to be. We've lived here for 5 years. He can't just throw us out. According to this, we're classified as guests, not tenants. There's a clause in Mom's trust that I don't care about clauses." Vanessa's voice had risen to a pitch that made the window seem to vibrate. "This is your fault, Mike. You should have made him sign papers years ago. You should have gotten your name on the deed when your mother died. Instead, you just let everything stay in his control because you were too weak to stand up and take what was rightfully yours." Emily told me that something changed in her father's face at that moment. A stillness came over him, the kind that precedes either surrender or rebellion. "What papers, Vanessa?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "What exactly should I have made him sign?" Vanessa hesitated, realizing too late that she'd revealed something she shouldn't have. "I just meant general estate planning, making sure our interests were protected." "Our interests?" Michael set the letter down on the coffee table. "You've been talking about this house like it was ours from the day we moved in. You told me we were building equity, that this was our investment, our future. But according to this document, we never had any legal claim to it at all. So, I'm going to ask you again. What have you been doing behind my back?" The argument that followed was the worst Emily had ever witnessed. Vanessa cycled through every tactic in her arsenal. Terrors, accusations, threats, guilt. She called Michael ungrateful for questioning her after everything she had done for this family. She accused him of taking his father's side against his own wife. She threatened to leave and take Emily with her to make sure he never saw his daughter again. But Michael didn't back down. For the first time in their marriage, he stood his ground, asking questions Vanessa couldn't answer without exposing herself. Where had she gotten the idea that they could control the estate? Why had she been so insistent that Robert move in with them after Helen's death? What exactly did she mean when she said they had waited long enough? Emily watched from the top of the stairs, her backpack already packed and hidden in her closet. She had known this moment was coming since our meeting at the cafe. She had prepared for it the way her grandmother had prepared for everything, quietly, methodically, without revealing her hand. The fighting continued for hours. By 9, both of her parents were from shouting, and the living room looked like a battlefield. Vanessa had locked herself in the master bedroom, and Michael was sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at the letter as if it might reveal some answer he hadn't yet found. Emily made her move just after 10. She crept down the back stairs, avoiding the creaky third step, and slipped out through the kitchen door into the cool night air. Her phone was already in her hand, my number already dialed. "Grandpa," she whispered when I answered. "I'm ready. Can you come get me?" I was parked at the end of the street within 15 minutes. She climbed into the passenger seat with her backpack clutched to her chest, and I drove away without looking back. Neither of us spoke until we were miles from the house, the lights of the neighborhood fading in the rearview mirror. "Did you leave a note?" I asked. She nodded. "On my bed, just like we planned." The note was simple, Emily told me later. 8 words that would shatter whatever remained of Vanessa's careful facade. "I'm staying with Grandpa. Don't come looking for me." It was nearly midnight when Vanessa finally emerged from the bedroom, her eyes red and swollen, looking for her daughter to manipulate into taking her side. She called Emily's name once, twice, then climbed the stairs with growing unease. Vanessa ran upstairs, threw open Emily's door, and found the empty room. The note trembled in her hands as she screamed her daughter's name into the silence. I learned what happened next from Linda herself, who called me the following afternoon with something close to satisfaction in her voice. She had been expecting Vanessa to make a move. She said people like her always did when they felt cornered. The only question had been what form the desperation would take. Vanessa spent the morning after Emily's disappearance in a state of barely controlled hysteria. She called the police first, demanding they arrest me for kidnapping, but the officer who responded explained patiently that a 16-year-old choosing to stay with her grandfather wasn't a criminal matter. Emily had left voluntarily. She had left a note. There was no evidence of coercion or danger. The police suggested family mediation and left Vanessa screaming on the front porch. When law enforcement failed her, Vanessa turned to the legal system. She spent hours online researching attorneys who specialized in family disputes and elder law, building a case in her mind that would paint me as a manipulative old man who had brainwashed her daughter and stolen her family's rightful inheritance. By midday, she had compiled a list of 3 law firms within driving distance, and she set out with the determination of someone who had never been told no. The first firm declined to take her case after a brief consultation. The attorney cited conflicts of interest without elaborating, and Vanessa stormed out, convinced that I had somehow gotten to them first. The second firm was more direct. They explained that without evidence of actual wrongdoing, a lawsuit against a property owner exercising his legal rights would be frivolous and potentially expose her to countersuits. Vanessa left that office trembling with rage. The third name on her list was Linda Graves, attorney at law, specializing in elder law and estate protection. Vanessa didn't recognize the name from the eviction letter. She had been too panicked to read the fine print, too focused on the 30-day deadline to notice who had drafted the document. She drove to Linda's Victorian office on the outskirts of town, rehearsing her story the entire way. The concerned daughter-in-law, the vulnerable family, the vindictive patriarch tearing everyone apart. Linda's assistant showed her to the waiting room, and Vanessa sat there for 20 minutes flipping through magazines without seeing them, mentally preparing her performance. When the inner office door finally opened, she stood up with her best worried mother expression already in place. And then she saw who was standing in the doorway. Linda Graves was tall and silver-haired with sharp eyes that assessed Vanessa in a single knowing glance. She wore a simple gray suit and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the worst of human behavior. Her expression was pleasant but utterly unreadable. "Mrs. Hensley," Linda said, "please come in." Vanessa followed her into the office, still not recognizing the connection, still believing she had found an ally. She launched into her prepared speech before she had even fully settled into the chair. "My father-in-law has been acting erratically. He's turned my daughter against me. He's threatening to throw us out of our home. I need someone to help me protect my family." Linda listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly on the desk, her face betraying nothing. When Vanessa finally paused for breath, Linda spoke in a voice that was calm, almost gentle. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hensley, I can't take your case." Vanessa blinked. "What? Why not?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss my reasons, but I haven't even finished explaining the situation. My father-in-law is clearly suffering from some kind of mental decline. He's making irrational decisions, manipulating my daughter. I'm afraid my answer is final." Something shifted in Vanessa's face, then the mask of the worried mother slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "Is this because of him? Did Robert Hensley get to you first? Is that why no one in this town will help me?" Linda remained perfectly still. "I'm not going to discuss other clients with you, Mrs. Hensley. This is outrageous." Vanessa's voice had risen to the sharp pitch that usually made people back down. "I'll report you to the Bar Association. I'll make sure everyone knows you're refusing to help a mother protect her child. Mrs. Hensley." Linda's tone hadn't changed, but something in it made Vanessa stop mid-sentence. "Before you make any more threats, there's something you should see." She reached into a drawer and withdrew a manila folder, the same folder she had shown me days earlier. From it, she produced a single photograph and slid it across the desk. Vanessa looked down and froze. "Why you came to Ohio, and I know exactly what you plan to do to Robert Hensley." She paused. "I also know that my dear friend Helen Hensley spent the last year of her life making sure you would never succeed." Vanessa stumbled backward, the photograph still clutched in her hand, burning in her vision. For the first time in her life, she had no words. The hunter had become the hunted. 3 days after Vanessa's encounter with Linda, my son appeared on my doorstep. I had been sitting in the living room with Emily, helping her with her homework the way I used to when she was small, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Emily looked up, her face tightening with anxiety, but I placed a hand on her shoulder to calm her. "Go upstairs for a little while," I said. "Your father and I need to talk." She nodded and gathered her book, slipping past Michael as he walked through the front door. He looked terrible, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing the same wrinkled shirt he had probably slept in. The confident architect who had once designed buildings that touched the sky now stood in my foyer like a man who had lost his way in familiar territory. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. "Come in, Michael." He stepped inside and stopped looking around the house where he had grown up, as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes moved from the family photographs on the mantel to the kitchen doorway where Helen used to stand calling him for dinner. He walked slowly through the living room, running his fingers along the back of the couch, pausing at the window, where his mother's reading chair still sat exactly as she had left it. "I forgot how much this place feels like her," he said quietly. "She's everywhere here. She always will be." Michael continued his slow circuit of the room, stopping at a framed photograph of himself as a boy, maybe 8 years old, holding up a fish he had caught at the lake, grinning with pure joy. I remembered that day perfectly. Helen had packed a picnic lunch, and we had stayed by the water until sunset, the three of us together, not knowing how precious those ordinary moments would become. "I don't know what's real anymore," Michael said, still staring at the photograph. "Vanessa came home from some lawyer's office yesterday, and she was different, scared. She wouldn't tell me what happened, but she started talking about leaving town, starting over somewhere else. She said we needed to cut our losses." "And what did you say?" He turned to face me. I said I wasn't going anywhere until I understood what was happening. She screamed at me for an hour, called me weak, called me stupid, said I was just like you, too naive to see what was right in front of me. He laughed bitterly. "But I'm starting to think maybe you saw everything, Dad. Maybe you were the only one who did." I gestured toward the couch. "Sit down, son. There's something you need to hear." He sat, and I retrieved the old digital recorder from the drawer where I had been keeping it. I placed it on the coffee table between us, my finger hovering over the play button. "Your mother made these recordings in the last year of her life," I said. "She never told me about them. She never told anyone except her attorney. She was protecting us both, Michael, in ways neither of us understood until now." I pressed play, and Helen's voice filled the room. Michael listened in silence as the recordings unfolded. Vanessa, pressuring Helen to sign over assets, making veiled threats about my health, speaking about our family as if we were obstacles to be removed rather than people to be loved. With each conversation, I watched my son's face change. The confusion gave way to recognition, then to horror, and finally to a grief so profound it seemed to age him years and minutes. When Vanessa's voice said, "You won't live forever, Helen, and when you're gone, Robert will need someone to take care of him, someone like me," Michael made a sound like a wounded animal. He doubled over his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. And when Helen's voice replied steady and fierce, "I know exactly what you are, Vanessa, and I've prepared for you," my son began to weep. I let the final recording play, Helen's message to me, her voice thin with illness but strong with love, telling me that everything was in place, that she believed in me, that it was my turn now. When it ended, the silence in the room was absolute. "I let her do this to you," Michael said through his tears. "I let her do this to Mom, to Emily." I stood there and watched and did nothing because I was too much of a coward to see what was happening. He looked up at me, his face ravaged. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." I moved to sit beside him on the couch, placing my hand on his shoulder the way I had when he was a boy, waking from nightmares. "Your mother forgave you before she died. I said she wrote it in her letter. She knew you were blinded by love, and she didn't blame you for it. She only wanted to make sure you'd have a chance to see clearly when the time came." "How can you forgive me?" he asked, "after everything I let happen." "Because you're my son," I said simply. "Because forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to move forward instead of staying trapped in the past. The question isn't whether I forgive you, Michael. The question is whether you can forgive yourself." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the recorder on the table, at the device that held his mother's voice and his wife's betrayal in equal measure. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw but steady. "What do I do now?" I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man I had watched drift away, the father who still had a chance to be there for his daughter. "You have a choice to make," I said. "You can stay with her and watch everything fall apart, or you can come home." Mike looked at his father, tears streaming down his face. "What do I do now?" he whispered again. Robert's answer was simple. "You choose, her or us." Michael left my house that evening with a folder tucked under his arm. Inside were copies of everything: the recordings, the investigation file on Veronica Shaw, the screenshots Emily had saved, and a set of legal separation papers Linda had prepared at my request. I didn't know if he would use them. I didn't know if he had the strength to confront the woman he had loved for nearly a decade. But I knew he had heard the truth. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. He called me the next morning, his voice but steady. "It's done," he said. I told her everything. What followed was a confrontation that Michael would later describe to me in fragments, as if the memory was too painful to hold in one piece. He had arrived home close to midnight to find Vanessa pacing the living room, her phone in her hand, her face pale with anxiety. She'd been trying to reach him for hours, leaving messages that alternated between tearful pleas and sharp accusations. "Where have you been?" she demanded the moment he walked through the door. Michael set the folder on the kitchen counter and looked at her with eyes that no longer held any illusion. "I was at my father's house," he said. "I know who you really are, Vanessa. I heard the recordings." The transformation was immediate. Vanessa's face cycled through a dozen expressions in seconds. Shock, fear, calculation, and finally the desperate performance of a woman whose mask had been ripped away. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as if on command. "Mike, whatever your father played for you, it's not what you think. He's manipulating you. He's always hated me, and now he's using fake recordings to turn you against me. They're not fake. That's my mother's voice. I'd know it anywhere. Then they're edited, taken out of context. Your father is sick, Mike. He's old and confused, and he can't stand that I saw through him." She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. "Please, you have to believe me. I'm the victim here. I've spent years trying to hold this family together while your father undermined everything I did." Michael opened the folder and pulled out the legal separation papers. He set them on the counter between them like a wall. "I'm not filing for divorce yet," he said quietly, "but I'm done pretending. I'm done watching you manipulate everyone around you. I'm done being blind to what you are." The tears stopped as suddenly as they had started. Something cold moved behind Vanessa's eyes. Something that had always been there, but that Michael had never allowed himself to see. "If you leave me," she said, her voice dropping to a hiss, "I'll destroy your father. I'll tell everyone he's senile, that he manipulated Emily, that he's been financially abusing this family for years. I'll make sure no one believes a word he says." Michael picked up the folder and held it where she could see the contents, the photographs, the court documents, the transcripts of her own recorded words. "Go ahead," he said. "The evidence we have will bury you." For a long moment they stood there in silence, husband and wife, strangers wearing familiar faces. Then Michael walked past her, climbed the stairs, and began packing a bag. Vanessa didn't follow him. She stood frozen in the kitchen, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her until she heard the front door close and his car pull out of the driveway. Alone in the house that was no longer hers, Vanessa did what she always did when she was cornered. She called her mother. Gloria Shaw answered on the third ring, her voice flat and unsurprised. "Vanessa, I wondered when I'd hear from you. Mom, everything is falling apart. Mike knows about Arizona. He has recordings, documents. They know about Gerald Patterson. They know my real name. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Gloria spoke again, her tone was ice. "You got caught. I told you to be more careful. I told you the wife was suspicious, but you insisted you had everything under control. I did have it under control. That old woman was dying. I never thought she'd... You never thought." Gloria's laugh was brittle. "That's always been your problem, Vanessa. You're impatient. You push too hard, too fast. Gerald Patterson was the same way. I warned you then, too." Vanessa's voice rose to a desperate pitch. "Mom, please. You taught me everything. You showed me how to find the right targets, how to build trust, how to position myself. You can't just abandon me now." The silence that followed was longer this time, heavy with something Vanessa had never heard in her mother's voice before. Contempt. "I've taught many people, Vanessa, over the years. Quite a few. But you're the only one stupid enough to get caught." "What do you mean others, Mom? What are you talking about? Did you really think you were special?" Gloria's voice was almost amused now. Did you think you were the only one I trained? There are others out there, Vanessa, doing exactly what you did, but doing it correctly. They don't leave trails. They don't get recorded by dying women. They don't lose their tempers and push their marks out before the time is right. Vanessa felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about her relationship with her mother, the special bond, the shared secrets, the legacy she was carrying forward, was crumbling into dust. Mom, I need you. I don't know what to do. You should have thought about that before you fumbled the easiest job I ever gave you. Gloria's voice hardened. Don't call me again. The line went dead. Vanessa stared at the phone in her hand, the screen dark, the silence absolute. Her mother's final words echoed in the empty kitchen. You're on your own now. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to have no one. Linda's office felt different on the day of the meeting. The warm light that had seemed welcoming during my previous visits now carried a sharper edge, illuminating every corner, leaving no shadows where secrets could hide. I arrived early with Emily and Michael, the three of us sitting together on one side of the long conference table, while Linda arranged folders and documents with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes late, flanked by an attorney she had hired the day before, a young man in an expensive suit who clearly had no idea what he was walking into. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing the soft pastels and modest jewelry that had always been part of her performance, but the effect was ruined by the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her jaw. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept in days, which was probably true. Thank you all for coming, Linda said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had conducted dozens of these meetings over her career. I've asked everyone here today to resolve certain matters regarding the Hensley family estate and the conduct of Vanessa Hensley, also known as Veronica Shaw. Vanessa's attorney frowned at the unfamiliar name, but said nothing. Before we begin, Linda continued, I want to make it clear that everything discussed in this room is supported by documentary evidence. Mrs. Hensley will have the opportunity to respond to each item as it is presented. She opened the first folder and slid a photograph across the table, the same image she had shown Vanessa at their previous encounter. Vanessa next to Gerald Patterson, smiling, her arm linked through his. This photograph was taken in Scottsdale, Arizona, approximately 8 years ago. The man pictured is Gerald Patterson, a retired professor who died 6 months after this image was captured. His estate, valued at approximately $300,000, was inherited entirely by a woman named Veronica Shaw, the woman we now know as Vanessa Hensley. Vanessa's attorney leaned forward, studying the photograph. My client has informed me that this is a case of mistaken identity. Then perhaps your client can explain these. Linda produced a stack of court documents from the Arizona probate case, along with copies of Veronica Shaw's driver's license and the legal name change filing from 6 years ago. The paper trail was unbroken, irrefutable. The attorney's face tightened as he reviewed the documents. Vanessa sat rigid beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Linda moved to the second folder. These are audio recordings made by Helen Hensley during the final year of her life. Ohio is a one-party consent state, meaning Mrs. Hensley had every legal right to record conversations she participated in. She pressed play on a small speaker, and Helen's voice filled the room, followed by Vanessa's, the threats, the manipulation, the cold calculation laid bare for everyone to hear. Michael flinched at the sound of his mother's voice. Emily reached over and took his hand. The third folder contained Emily's screenshots, the messages between Vanessa and the contact saved as VS, discussing the timeline, the inheritance, the plan to cash out once Robert was gone. Vanessa's attorney read through them in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each page. We've also obtained information about the contact identified as VS, Linda said. This individual has been identified as Gloria Shaw, Vanessa's mother. Mrs. Shaw is currently under investigation in 3 other states for similar schemes involving elder financial exploitation. The FBI has expressed interest in any evidence that might connect her to additional victims. At the mention of her mother, something broke in Vanessa's composure. Her carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing the desperate, cornered woman beneath. These are all lies, she said, her voice rising. Fabrications designed to destroy me. My mother has nothing to do with this. Mrs. Hensley, her attorney, said quietly, I need to speak with you privately. No, Vanessa's voice cracked. I'm not leaving this room until these people admit what they're doing. They're trying to steal my family, my home, everything I've worked for. You worked for nothing." It was Michael who spoke, his voice flat and final. "You targeted this family the way you targeted Gerald Patterson. You married me to get to my parents' money. Everything about our life together was a lie." Vanessa turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "Mike, please. I love you. I've always loved you. Whatever mistakes I made, I did them for us, for our future. Don't." Emily's voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through her mother's performance. "Don't pretend anymore. We all know the truth now." The room fell silent. Vanessa's attorney closed the folder in front of him, removed his glasses, and stood. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot represent this case. The evidence presented here is overwhelming, and continuing to advocate on your behalf would compromise my professional ethics." He gathered his briefcase and walked out without looking back. Vanessa sat alone now, surrounded by the family she had tried to destroy. Michael had turned away from her, unable to even look in her direction. Emily stared at the table, her jaw set, and I watched her from across the polished wood. The woman who had called me useless, who had laughed as I walked out of my own home, who had spent years plotting to take everything I had. "I'm not sending you to prison, Vanessa," I said, though I could. "The evidence here is enough for criminal charges in 2 states. But that's not what Helen would have wanted, and it's not what I want either." I slid a final document across the table, a legal agreement prepared by Linda, relinquishing all claims to the Hensley family, the property, and any future inheritance. "Sign this and leave quietly," I said. "Start over somewhere else under whatever name you choose, or refuse, and I release everything to the police and the press. The choice is yours." Vanessa looked around the room at her husband, who had turned away at her daughter, who refused to meet her eyes, at the old man she had underestimated. The empire she built on lies had crumbled in a single hour. The pen trembled in Vanessa's hand as she signed the documents. I watched her face as she wrote her name first on the property relinquishment, then on the asset waiver, then on the custody agreement that gave Michael full parental rights over Emily. Each signature seemed to drain something from her, some vital energy that had kept her performance running for all these years. By the time she set down the pen, she looked hollowed out, a shell of the confident woman who had walked into Linda's office an hour earlier. No one spoke as she gathered her purse and stood. Michael kept his back to her. Emily stared at the table. I met her eyes briefly, those calculating eyes that had measured my worth and found it wanting, and saw something I had never seen there before. Fear, not of me, but of the future. She now faced a future without the safety net she had spent years weaving from other people's lives. She left without a word, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like finality. In the days that followed, I learned through Linda and various legal channels exactly what Vanessa's signature had cost her. The house on Maple Ridge Drive reverted fully to my control, and I arranged for a property management company to handle its sale. I had no desire to keep it. Too many memories had been poisoned there. The proceeds would go into a trust for Emily's education, managed by Linda, until my granddaughter turned 25. The cars registered in my name were reclaimed. The credit cards tied to family accounts were canceled. The health insurance Vanessa had enjoyed through Michael's employer was terminated the moment their separation became official. One by one, the threads of the life she had constructed were cut away, leaving her with nothing but what she had brought into the marriage, which, as it turned out, was almost nothing at all. But the financial losses were only the beginning. 2 weeks after the signing, Vanessa was called into her supervisor's office at the marketing firm where she had worked for 3 years. Linda had kept her promise to share the investigation findings with relevant parties, and somewhere along the chain of information, Vanessa's employer had learned about the Arizona case. The name changed the pattern of behavior that suggested their employee was not who she claimed to be. They let her go quietly, citing restructuring, but everyone in the office knew the truth. Word spreads quickly in professional circles, especially word about fraud. She tried to find another position, but her references had dried up. Former colleagues who had once praised her work ethic now declined to take her calls. The networking contacts she had cultivated so carefully over the years suddenly became unavailable, too busy, unable to help. In a matter of weeks, Vanessa went from being a respected professional with a promising career to being unemployable. Her reputation so thoroughly tainted that even companies who hadn't heard the specifics sensed something wrong, and passed on her applications. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest consequence, though I took no pleasure in it. Vanessa had always been the center of every gathering, the woman who organized dinner parties and charity events, who knew everyone's name and everyone's business. Now those same people crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations stopped arriving, phone calls went unanswered. The friends she had collected, like accessories, discovered that friendship with Vanessa Hensley, or Veronica Shaw, as some now whispered, carried a social cost they weren't willing to pay. I heard from Emily that Vanessa had moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the spacious home she had once claimed as her own. The building was old, the neighborhood rough, the kind of place where people minded their own business because they had troubles enough without borrowing anyone else's. She had sold her jewelry to cover the security deposit in first month's rent. She was working part-time at a call center, the only job she could find that didn't require references or background checks. Emily visited her once about a month after everything ended. She came back quiet and thoughtful, and when I asked her how it went, she simply said, "She's different now, smaller." I thought about that word for a long time. Smaller. Vanessa had always seemed so large, so dominant, filling every room she entered with her presence and her demands, but stripped of her schemes and her safety nets, without a family to manipulate or a future to steal. She had shrunk down to her true size, just an ordinary woman who had made terrible choices and was finally facing the consequences. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. After everything she had done to Helen, to me, to Michael and Emily, she deserved every bit of suffering that came her way. But Helen had never been about revenge, and neither was I. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the weariness that comes when a long battle finally ends and you realize how much it cost you to fight it. On a rainy evening about 6 weeks after the signing, Emily showed me something on her phone. One of her friends had seen Vanessa at a grocery store alone, buying the cheapest brands of everything, counting coins at the register. The image stayed with me longer than I expected. This woman who had once mocked my cooking and complained about the thread count of our sheets, now struggling to afford basic necessities. I wondered if she ever thought about how it all went wrong, if she lay awake at night replaying her mistakes, searching for the moment when she could have chosen differently, if she understood yet that her downfall wasn't caused by bad luck or persecution, but by the simple truth that you cannot build a life on lies and expect it to stand. Somewhere across town, in a cramped apartment with thin walls and flickering lights, Vanessa sat alone before a bathroom mirror. The face that stared back at her was gaunt, aged, unrecognizable. She whispered to herself in the silence. He never raised his voice. He never threatened me. And he still destroyed everything. The mirror offered no comfort, only truth. 2 months passed before Linda called me back to her office. The legal matters had been settled, the documents filed, the property transfers completed. I assumed she wanted to review some final paperwork, perhaps discuss the ongoing investigation into Gloria Shaw that the FBI had taken over. What I didn't expect was the cream-colored envelope she placed on her desk the moment I sat down. Helen gave me this shortly before she died. Linda said she made me promise not to open it and not to give it to you until everything was resolved. She slid the envelope across the polished wood. Her exact words were, "Only give this to him after he's won." I stared at the envelope, recognizing Helen's handwriting on the front, my name written in the same graceful script that had addressed birthday cards and love notes for half a century. The paper was slightly yellowed now, aged by the 2 years it had waited in Linda's keeping. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of whatever waited inside. "I'll give you some privacy," Linda said, rising from her chair. "Take as long as you need." The door clicked shut behind her, and I was alone with my wife's final words. I opened the envelope slowly, savoring the last moment before I would read whatever Helen had wanted me to know. Inside were 2 pages of her handwriting, and a formal document I didn't immediately recognize. I unfolded the letter first and began to read. "My dearest Robert," she wrote, "if you're reading this, you've won. The battle I couldn't fight beside you has finally ended, and you're still standing. I'm so proud of you. Prouder than I could ever say in person, because you would have brushed it off the way you always do when someone tells you how remarkable you are." I had to stop and wipe my eyes before I could continue. I knew this day would come. I knew Vanessa would make her move eventually, and I knew you would struggle with what to do about it. You've always been too kind, Robert, too willing to see the good in people, too quick to forgive. It's one of the things I love most about you, but it's also your greatest vulnerability. That's why I had to prepare everything in advance. I couldn't trust you to be ruthless when ruthlessness was required. A sound escaped my throat somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Even from beyond the grave, Helen knew me better than I knew myself. I want you to understand something important. What you did wasn't revenge, it was justice. There's a difference, even if the world sometimes confuses the two. Revenge is about making someone suffer because you're angry. Justice is about making sure they can't hurt anyone else. You protected our son, our granddaughter, and yourself. You honored the life we built together by refusing to let it be stolen. That's not cruelty, that's love. The second page was shorter, but its contents would change everything. There's one more thing I prepared, something I never told anyone except Linda. 5 years ago, when Emily was just starting middle school, I opened an education trust in her name. I've been adding to it ever since, a little at a time from an account Vanessa never knew existed. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to give Emily choices. College, graduate school, whatever path she decides to take. I turned to the formal document that had been folded inside the letter. It was a trust agreement dated 5 years earlier establishing the Emily Grace Hensley Education Fund. The current balance, according to the attached statement, was just over $170,000. Helen had been saving for Emily's future while she was dying of cancer. While she was gathering evidence and building legal fortresses and fighting a secret war against the woman who had infiltrated our family, she had also been quietly setting aside money to ensure that her granddaughter would have opportunities no matter what happened. Emily is the light of our family, the letter continued. I watched her grow from a curious toddler into a thoughtful young woman, and I always knew she would be the one who saw the truth when the time came. She has my eyes. Robert, you've said so yourself 100 times. But more importantly, she has my instincts. She sees what others miss. This trust is my gift to her future, and my way of telling her that I believed in her long before she believed in herself. The final paragraph was brief, but it broke me completely. I have to go now, my love. The medicine is making it hard to write, and I want these words to be clear. Thank you for 50 years of happiness. Thank you for being the kind of man worth protecting. And thank you for finishing what I started. I'll be watching from wherever I am, cheering you on, loving you still. Forever yours, Helen. I sat in that office and wept, not from sadness this time, but from a love so profound it felt like my chest couldn't contain it. Helen had thought of everything. She had protected us all, arranged for our futures, and left nothing to chance. Even in death, she was still taking care of her family. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard the door open. Emily stepped inside, her face uncertain, having been told by Linda that I might need her. "Grandpa," she said softly, "are you okay?" I held up the letter, the trust document, the proof of a grandmother's love that had reached across the years to embrace her. "What did Grandma say?" Emily asked, moving closer. I smiled through my tears and pulled her into an embrace. "She said she always believed in you, and she was right." Later that evening, after Emily had read the letter herself and shed her own tears, I stood alone in the living room of the house Helen and I had built together. Her photograph watched me from the mantel, that familiar smile frozen in time, her eyes still bright with the intelligence and love that had defined our life together. I looked at Helen's photograph on the mantel and smiled through my tears. "You planned further than any of us could imagine. Thank you, my love. 6 months can change everything." The woodworking shed that had sat dormant for years was alive again, filled with the smell of fresh sawdust and the sound of sandpaper against grain. I had spent weeks cleaning it out, organizing the tools, replacing the worn workbench with a new one built from oak I selected myself. Helen would have approved. She always said that healing happens best when your hands are busy. Emily had moved in permanently after the custody arrangements were finalized. Her room was the same one Michael had slept in as a boy, and I sometimes caught her standing in the doorway looking at the old photographs on the walls, trying to connect the smiling child in the pictures with the complicated man her father had become. She was doing well in her new school, making friends, slowly rebuilding a life that had been shattered by her mother's choices. On Saturday mornings, she joined me in the shed. "Grandma used to sit right there," I told her one day, pointing to the corner where I had placed a new stool. She'd read aloud while I worked, said the rhythm of sanding helped her think. Emily ran her fingers along the smooth surface of the wood we had been shaping into a bookshelf. Will you teach me not just to watch, but to actually do it? You want to learn woodworking? She nodded, her expression serious in a way that reminded me so much of Helen it made my chest ache. Grandma and you did this together. Now I want to do it with you. I want to make something that lasts. So I taught her. We started with simple projects. A picture frame, a small jewelry box, a birdhouse for the backyard. She learned to measure twice and cut once to feel the grain of the wood before deciding how to shape it, to find satisfaction in the slow process of turning raw lumber into something beautiful. Her hands grew calloused, her patience deepened, and somewhere in those quiet hours of shared work, the grief she carried began to transform into something gentler. Michael started visiting on Sundays. The first few times were awkward, filled with long silences and careful conversations that avoided anything too painful. He would stand at the edge of the shed, watching Emily and me work, unsure of his place in this new configuration of family. But gradually, tentatively, he began to participate. He held boards while I cut them. He helped Emily sand the edges of her projects. He remembered skills I had taught him decades ago when he was young and eager, and hadn't yet been lost to a woman who saw him only as a means to an end. One afternoon, while Emily was inside making lunch, Michael and I sat on the bench outside the shed, looking out over the backyard where he had played as a child. The silence between us was comfortable now, earned through months of small moments and careful rebuilding. I should have protected you, Dad, he said finally. All those years I watched her treat you like you didn't matter, and I never said anything. I let her convince me that you were the problem. I let her. You were blinded by love. I interrupted gently. I was too once. When I first met your mother, I couldn't see straight for weeks. Love does that to people. It's not weakness. It's being human. He shook his head. That's too easy. I made choices. I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. I chose her comfort over your dignity. Yes, I agreed. You did. I agreed. And now you're choosing differently. That's what matters. Michael turned to look at me, his eyes red-rimmed. How do I make it right? After everything that happened, how do I ever make it right? I put my hand on his shoulder the way I had when he was a boy, and the world seemed too big and frightening to face alone. You already are, I said. You're here. Through the kitchen window, I could see Emily watching us. When she caught my eyes, she smiled a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind I hadn't seen from her since before everything fell apart. She was witnessing something she had never experienced before. Her father and grandfather sitting together in peace. Two men who had found their way back to each other through the wreckage of betrayal. That night, after Michael had gone home and Emily had finished her homework, I sat at the desk in my bedroom and opened the journal Helen had given me years ago. I had never been much of a writer, but lately I found comfort in recording my thoughts and creating a record of this strange and painful and ultimately redemptive chapter of my life. I wrote a single line on the fresh page. I didn't lose a family. I reclaimed one. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. When Emily knocked on my door and asked if I wanted to watch it with her, we stood on the back porch together, wrapped in the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from true understanding. Grandpa, she asked softly as the colors deepened, can we stay here forever? I put my arm around her shoulders and smiled. This is your home now. It always was. 1 year to the day since I walked out of that house on Maple Ridge Drive, I stood on my front porch and watched the morning unfold. The garden was exploding with color. Tulips and daffodils and the first brave roses of the season, all descendants of the flowers Helen had planted when we were young and thought we had forever. The air smelled of fresh earth and possibility, and somewhere in the oak tree a cardinal was singing the same song it had sung every spring for as long as I could remember. I was 73 years old and I had never felt more alive. Emily's car pulled into the driveway just after 9, right on schedule. She had started college in the fall, choosing a university close enough that she could come home every weekend. The education fund Helen had secretly created covered her tuition and housing with enough left over to give her freedom. The freedom to study what she loved, to explore who she wanted to become, to build a future unconstrained by financial worry. She was majoring in architecture, she had told me recently, because she wanted to design things that would outlast her, things that would shelter people long after she was gone. I heard Helen's influence in those words, and it made my heart swell with pride. "Morning, Grandpa," she called, climbing out of her car with a bag of groceries in her arms. "I brought stuff for Sunday dinner. Dad's coming over later to help with the deck." Michael's truck appeared at the end of the street as if on cue. He had moved into a small house about 10 minutes away, a modest place with a workshop in the garage where he had started building furniture in his spare time. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, and though the process had been painful, he had emerged from it steadier than I had seen him in years. He visited almost daily now, stopping by after work to share a cup of coffee, spending weekends helping me with projects around the property. We were making up for lost time, rebuilding the relationship that had nearly been destroyed by silence and manipulation. The three of us gathered on the back porch, planning the afternoon's work on the new deck. I was building a place where we could sit together on summer evenings, watching the fireflies and telling stories the way families are supposed to do. Emily spread out the blueprints she had drafted as a class project, pointing out modifications she thought would improve the design. Michael studied them with genuine interest, asking questions, offering suggestions. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the comfortable silences of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. I didn't notice her at first. None of us did. Across the street, half hidden behind the neighbor's fence, a woman stood watching. She was thinner than she had been a year ago, her clothes worn and ill-fitting, her hair pulled back in a careless ponytail. She held a paper coffee cup in one hand, the kind you get from gas stations, and she stood so still she might have been a statue. Vanessa, or Veronica, whatever name she went by now. I only caught a glimpse of her as I turned to get more coffee from the kitchen. For a single moment our eyes met across the distance. The old man she had mocked and the predator who had underestimated him. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes held something I recognized. Not anger, not hatred, just emptiness. The hollow look of someone who had lost everything and finally understood that it was never coming back. She watched us for perhaps a minute longer, watching Emily laugh at something Michael said, watching Michael clap me on the shoulder, watching the family she had tried to claim going on without her. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner without looking back. No one else noticed. She had become what she feared most, invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. I didn't mention it to Emily or Michael. There was no need. Vanessa was no longer part of our story. She was just a shadow passing at the edge of our lives. A reminder of how close we had come to losing everything, and how much we had gained by refusing to let her win. That evening, after Emily had driven back to campus and Michael had gone home, I sat alone in the living room with Helen's photo album open on my lap. The pages were filled with decades of memories. Our wedding day, Michael's first steps, family vacations and holiday dinners and ordinary afternoons that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now glowed with preciousness. I turned to my favorite photograph, the one of Helen standing in this very garden, her hands dirty from planting, her smile bright with the simple joy of creating something beautiful. "We did it, sweetheart," I said softly, touching her face through the protective plastic. "We protected them all. Michael found his way back. Emily is going to be extraordinary. And me, I'm still here, still standing, still grateful for every day you gave me." I closed the album and set it aside, then walked to the window to look out at the garden she had planted so many years ago. The flowers swayed gently in the evening breeze, alive and thriving, carrying her love forward into seasons she would never see. Some people build families, others try to destroy them. I had learned the difference in the hardest way possible, through betrayal and heartbreak, and the long, slow work of rebuilding what had been broken. But I had also learned something else, something Helen had known all along. You don't need revenge to defeat your enemies. Sometimes you just need to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. I didn't seek to destroy Vanessa. I simply stopped shielding her from the truth. And in the end, that was enough. The cardinals sang again from the oak tree, and I smiled. That was the year Vanessa learned the hardest truth of all. Robert never needed them. They needed him. And by the time she understood that, it was already too late. And so ends the story of Robert Hensley, A man who was told he was useless and discovered he was irreplaceable. What began as a humiliation at a dinner table became a journey of quiet strength, unexpected allies, and justice delivered not through anger, but through truth. Helen's love reached beyond the grave to protect the family she cherished. Emily found the courage to see what adults around her refused to acknowledge. Michael learned that silence in the face of cruelty is its own form of betrayal, and that redemption begins with showing up. And Robert proved that you don't need to raise your voice to make yourself heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop accepting less than you deserve. Vanessa thought she was playing a long game, but she never understood the rules. She saw kindness as weakness, patience as ignorance, and love as a tool for manipulation. In the end, she lost everything, not because Robert destroyed her, but because she destroyed herself. The truth has a way of catching up with those who run from it. If this story moved you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Have you watched someone you love be mistreated and wished you had spoken up sooner? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be the one that helps someone else find their own strength. And if you believe that quiet dignity will always triumph over loud cruelty, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the reminder that justice exists is enough to help someone hold on. Thank you for staying until the end. Until next time, remember, some people build families and some people try to tear them apart. Choose to be a builder.